Yesterday we got the full Jurassic World Rebirth reveal of this thing. Now whilst the trailer and the articles didn't actually give it a name, it has been known as the D-Rex in rumour and fan circles for some time now. But what the heck is it, and where did it come from? Let's see what we can find out. And this is going to be quite a deep dive, so bear with me. This island near Barbados, whatever it's called, is the first genetic facility that InGen created. This was their initial ground zero for figuring out the process of dinosaur creation. At least until the franchise soft reboots again and they decide they need yet another previously unknown dinosaur island. Anyway, in the past we believed that Isla Sorna was the first creation facility for all of these dinosaurs, and that island operated through most of the 80s building dinosaurs for Isla Nublar, i.e. the main Jurassic Park. That means logically that this island, we're going to call it Site C throughout this video just to make life easier, must have been active as long ago as the 1970s, because they would have abandoned this island before going and setting up the facility over on Isla Sorna. Now in the 80s and 90s, before and during Jurassic Park, InGen were creating dinosaurs through a combination of genuine dinosaur DNA from mosquitoes, and a little bit from bones if you read the novel, and then plugging the gaps with frog DNA. They are inherently all hybrids, and this of course goes on to cause problems because frogs are capable of shifting their sex depending on social and environmental factors. The dinosaurs then become capable of doing the exact same thing, and thus these hybrid dino frogs are capable of breeding in the wild. Now this is actually a much bigger deal in the novel than it is in the film, which really only has one scene dealing with the subject, but it is there, and the message is very clear. You've made dinosaurs, but you've done so without considering every angle, without considering the ramifications. You stood on the shoulders of giants and didn't earn that knowledge for yourself. The fact that Hammond and InGen are looking to open Jurassic Park imminently, very soon after the events of the film, without even realising their dinosaurs are capable of breeding, should tell you plenty about their wanton hubris. And that was InGen in the 90s, in their at least moderately successful dinosaur breeding program. If we're dialing back to the 70s when we assume Site C was established, the genetic creation tech would have been even more unknown, burgeoning, messy. I don't think, at least not all of the Site C dinosaurs are dino frogs, because you would think if this was happening a decade and 2 decades prior, they probably would have noticed the breeding. But there are a few options for what they could be instead. This is very early stage. Could InGen have been messing around with other animals to plug the gap, not just frogs, and causing unknown trouble in the meantime, unforeseen mutations, as the DNA just doesn't quite mesh together? It's worth keeping in mind that even the modern Jurassic World iteration of InGen and Masrani was making mistakes in this same area 30-40 years later. Blue the Velociraptor is capable, as we've seen, of parthenogenesis. That's the production of a viable embryo without fertilization, and that's because of the monitor lizard DNA that was present in her genetics. Hell, in the novel, it's not just frog DNA, they also use lizard and bird DNA to fill the gaps. All of these potential combinations would come with unknown effects, and combine that with what would be lower quality genetic tech a decade prior, and you've got the potential for mutations, well, unplanned mutations. One alternative to that is that they were experimenting with synthetic DNA, which is something we've been dabbling with as far back as the 1950s, although it is still a very new and growing technology in a lot of ways. Perhaps the Sorna and Nublar facilities were more successful because that's when they had the brainwave to plug the gap with existing animal genomes, as opposed to their Site C plan of simply engineering their own DNA sequences to plug the gap. This one I think is maybe a slightly more likely explanation for the mutations we're about to see. Because the thing is, a lot of the animals in Rebirth are almost there. The Titanosaurus is fairly normal, but then it has these bizarre speculative fins. We'll come back to these a little bit later. The Spinosaurus actually has a very accurate skull shape and body shape, but it's hidden under this big massive bulk and the thickest neck you've ever seen. Mike Tyson's got nothing on this Spinosaurus. The Quetzalcoatlus is accurately sized now, but it's ditched its more realistic crest for this aggressively pointed beak bit. Now the Tyrannosaurus Rex and the Dilophosaurus do basically resemble their Isla Nublar counterparts, but perhaps then these are the ones that worked. And they then decided to take this working technology to their next facility on Isla Sorna. You've kind of got to see Site C as an experiment. It's a throw everything at the wall and see what sticks brand of science, where an inexperienced, but headstrong and arrogant InGen are trying to play God, and the dinosaurs are mutating in unexpected ways as a result. Because then there's this thing, this two-headed raptor, and don't ask me how, I didn't notice it had a second head yesterday, is based on the patterning and hints of colour, not the Jurassic Park female, but it's actually the tiger raptor from The Lost World. And it's pretty good. The basal morphology is all there, and by and large it looks pretty accurate to the film version, except that it has two heads. Now this is something called polycephaly, and it's caused by genetic mutations resulting from an embryo not splitting correctly during development, process in turn called axial bifurcation. This thing being otherwise correct, everything is right except for, the two heads, suggests that this is InGen getting close. Perhaps they are at this point using the frog DNA, but they haven't quite nailed down the process. There's some issues going on with the embryo creation bit. The embryo isn't splitting correctly, but maybe this would have then been a standard The Lost World Velociraptor. So all of that finally brings us to the D-Rex. Now we know that this is their attempt to create a T-Rex, but something has of course gone horribly wrong along the way. Now this is obviously a little bit speculation, but I love the idea that they create their first successful animal, say the Dilophosaurus or a raptor we haven't seen yet, and then they immediately go off to make a Tyrannosaurus Rex because that's a very InGen thing to do, and this is what comes out at the other end. There's a lot that can go wrong in a genetic process like this, and even if you think you've nailed the genotype, and that's the genetic makeup of an animal, that doesn't mean the phenotype, its resulting characteristics, are going to be expressed in the way that you expect. Even modern cloned animals have an adult survival rate of less than 5%, and they often suffer from a myriad of illnesses and behavioural changes. See, the rumours have long stressed that the D-Rex is not a hybrid, it's a mutant. This isn't a couple of dinosaurs stuck together to make something monstrous a la the Indominus Rex, but it was meant to be a functioning, working Tyrannosaurus Rex. You can see that expressed to some extent in the short extra forearms, the shaping of the jaw, and it even has this huge dew claw to the back of its foot, just like the T-Rex. Now, given we do have a functioning Rex on the island, I think we have to assume the D-Rex was safely contained to the point that InGen felt comfortable continuing and perfecting their genetic process, potentially even experimenting on the D-Rex to try and find out what went wrong. Because surely when this thing breaks out, that spells the end for experimentation on this island. This scene here is probably showing that breakout sequence for the D-Rex, beginning with it tearing apart this poor lad in the holding chamber. Those red flashing lights are screaming emergency breakout. Now, I debated yesterday if this was a flashback or maybe a modern scene where they first discover and they accidentally release the D-Rex. But I think the size of the animal almost guarantees that this is taking place 30 to 40 years ago. In this scene, the human is about 40% the height of the D-Rex. Even with it kneeling down a little, you can see it's not gigantic compared to the human. It's large, but it's not massive. If we then cut to our modern scene on the dock, however, the extended foot of this thing is human size. Just the foot alone is human size. And the full beast is safely 4 to 5 times the size of Kincaid here. It's been loose on the island and feeding. I think that's the only logical conclusion. And that's why InGen abandoned the island and, armed with the better technology they developed since the creation of the D-Rex, have moved to set up the facility on Isla Sorna. So then what happened to make the D-Rex look like this? Well, as we've said, it would potentially be a mistake to try and attribute any of its more unusual characteristics to other dinosaurs, but we can find real-world counterparts in genetic mutations. There's a genetic mutation, for example, that occurs sometimes in humans, but more often in ruminants, called large offspring syndrome. Now, this is a condition caused by the misregulation of imprinted genes, and it happens much more often to animals created through assisted reproductive technologies, like the dinosaurs on Jurassic World. Large offspring syndrome, or LOS, often shows via macrosomia and macroglossia. That's increased body size and increased tongue size, and that's often represented by a slightly bulbous body shape or an increased globular look to particular parts of the body, such as this large bulbous area atop the skull of the D-Rex. I'm avoiding showing you pictures of LOS because I think they would be upsetting to some people, but you can Google it if you're curious. I do have a little side theory here as well. The fins on the Titanosaurus look very similar to the fins you'd see on a goldfish. We've got these thin slivers of bone strung together with a bit of muscle and some very thin skin that gives it this translucent appearance. It's much more akin to a goldfish or other fish than it is to a lizard. Now, there are breeds of goldfish with very prominent head growths, also known as wens, W-E-N-S, and, well, I would say this doesn't look dissimilar to what we see on the D-Rex. Perhaps this is a gene being expressed that they didn't expect when they were experimenting with plugging the gaps in the genome. It's worth noting that the Titanosaur, if we go back specifically, also has a bulbous head growth. I'm just saying. It would be a bit of a coincidence. Regardless, one thing I hope they do is frame the D-Rex at least somewhat sympathetically. This thing is probably suffering immensely. Such genetic abnormalities often accompany problems breathing, being increasingly prone to sickness, shortened lifespan, and much, much more. I'm sure it's a hyper-aggressive apex carnivore that's been causing havoc on the island, much like we heard the Spinosaurus did. But it's a monster of our own design. It's the logical endpoint of InGen's hubris and a damning indictment of their arrogance, given they would go on to create 2 more islands filled with dinosaurs. I'm sure it will be a creature of horror, as it should be, but I think if the film does its job well, we'll see it less as a straight up movie monster, and more as a brutal, lethal testament to what happens when you put scientific creation ahead of thought and morality. After all, that's very much something Crichton himself would have written.
Rainbow Road.